and we've got a great guest joining us. Mr. Jim Berkenstadt is joining us, and he's written a book called The Beatle Who Vanished. Jim, how are you doing this morning?
I'm great, Eddie. Thanks for having me on your show. I'm looking forward to our chat.
No problem. You know what? I got to give you a little bit of applause for being on the program.
Thank you.
It is you are known as the rock and roll detective. And
right.
I got to ask. I mean, you've done a lot of work. You've written a few books. Of course, the most recent one being the Beatle Who Vanished. But I want to ask you, how did you get the name the rock and roll detective?
Well, I think that goes back a ways. When I was doing, I started out doing some work just in the area of the Beatles' lost recordings, and dug up maybe over 1,300 unreleased recordings by the Beatles as of the mid-'90s, and did a book with a guy named Belmo called Black Market Beatles.
Right.
And I believe that came to the attention of Apple because they were at the same time working on the Beatles anthology. Later in the 90s, I started working, doing research for George Harrison while he was still alive, specifically on the All Things Must Pass reissue. He was looking to see about what unreleased recordings and things there were. And then I think later he mentioned something like that to the others at Apple. And then when Apple hired me to work on Beatle projects, I think that was in 2001, I believe that Neil Aspinall may have coined that phrase when we were talking about things, about trying to find archival things for Beatle projects in the future.
Wow. How do you go about unearthing that many unreleased recordings by the Beatles?
Well, I guess it goes back to about 1969, where the first bootlegs started to surface. At first, a lot of the Beatle bootlegs were in 69 and 70, were things people had recorded off the air that had never been released, like the Ed Sullivan Show or other teen music shows of that era.
Right.
And they had made recordings, and then someone got the bright idea, I guess, of pressing them on vinyl and putting them out. But then over time, there started to be things that just leaked out from different ways. Maybe a Beatle moved from one house to another, and the movers said, oh, here's some demos on a tape, and they vanish, and next thing you know, they get into the hands of bootleggers.
Right.
And then there was a pretty big group of unreleased Beatles studio recordings, that many of which later came out on their anthology. But back in the early 80s, EMI gave a project to an engineer who I think was sick at the time, and asked him to basically create a list of all the various Beatles recordings. And I think he might have made some dubs at the time onto cassette. So things happen different ways over the years. And basically when the Beatles broke up, I felt kind of a void personally, that there wouldn't be any more music coming out by the group.
Right.
So that's when I started to look in the backs of Rolling Stone magazine and other places for ads, and just basically over time developed a network of contacts.
Wow. On this program, we do a segment called The Bootleg Breakfast, where we play some of our favorite unreleased recordings or shared underground recordings. And so it's quite remarkable to have somebody who's done a lot of extensive work uncovering this stuff. Was there anything that you found during this initial work that you were like, wow, I cannot believe that I've located this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say absolutely yes. I remember walking into I think they called them head shops in the old days, in the 60s. It was the end of the decade, and there was this huge head shop the size of a Macy's department store in Chicago, and it was, covered with lots of colorful posters, black light posters and things like that, and incense and all that stuff. But on the wall there, I saw a Beatles double album cover that I didn't recognize, and I had all the regular releases. So I asked the guy to pull that down, and it was called Sweet Apple Tracks, and it contained 2 albums worth of the Beatles in the studio, joking, tuning their guitars, playing songs that they had never released,
Wow.
Rehearsing songs that they wanted to release. These ultimately came from the A and B roll audio tracks of the Let It Be movie performances.
Right.
And these were things that didn't make it into the final cut, and they were at some point stolen or given to an Apple employee, depending on who you believe.
Right.
And then they became the first really cool bootlegs of the Beatles, because live recordings had so much screaming and they weren't recorded well. But these were recorded very well on Nagra monaural reel-to-reel recorders, and you could hear every word of that time period, which was shortly before they broke up, maybe a year before they officially broke up.
Right.
And it was fascinating.
I can imagine. There's so many. I mean, they recorded for virtually a month doing the Let It
Right.
Be sessions, and there's so much. I mean, obviously it was a documentary, so there's so much footage, and I guess time where they're playing all kinds of different cover songs that they grew up on, and different introducing new music. I can only imagine. I mean, how much of that I guess has been archived from the Let It Be sessions?
When you say archived, what exactly
I mean, meaning,
do you mean? By them or by
anybody?
By anybody? Well, apparently, the little dribs and drabs came out over the years throughout the 1980s. But then there was sort of I would call this a test. An actual reel of this music was put into like a Sotheby's auction, and 1 or 2 reels were sold very quickly for, I don't know, $4,000 or $5,000, which
Wow.
was, of course, a lot more money back then than it is today even, and it's a lot today. And apparently that person was the one who had either been given these tapes or had stolen these tapes from Apple. And then as CDs became quite popular and started to take hold, this person made a deal with a bootleg company, which I believe was Yellow Dog.
Right.
And Yellow Dog, I believe, had these discs pressed in Japan and then distributed them all over the world. So actually, I would say all, 100 and some hours of these tapes have leaked out, but right now, Apple is in the middle of a litigation between them and these people who were later arrested. I think in 2001, I think they were arrested, and the tapes were taken away and given to Apple. And now, this year, those people are suing Apple to try to get the tapes back. So that'll be interesting.
That is incredible. I mean, it's quite a story. I mean, and speaking of stories, You've got this the book, The Beatle Who Vanished, obviously about Jimmy Nicol.
Right.
I wanted to ask you, how did you get into the story of
Right.
Jimmy Nicol? How did that all come about?
Great question. I think that what happened was I started to notice that he was always just a mere footnote in every Beatles biography I would read. And the footnote always read something like, Jimmy Nicol, the drummer who replaced Ringo Starr for a couple weeks on their first world tour in 1964, and then you'd never hear anything before or after Jimmy Nicol.
Right.
So, I looked online, and there was nothing at the time. Now, after the book's been out, of course, there's lots of things, eclipsed from my book, but I decided to spend a number of years looking into his life and finding the people who were either related to him or were musicians he played with, because I always wondered, how did this guy get the job? Why was he the one out of all the drummers in history? Why was he selected to be the Beatles drummer when Ringo got ill in June of '64. And then I also thought, well, if that's a good question, what was it like growing up for him? You know, how did he put himself in the position? What was his backstory to be in position to be in line for the job? What was it like during those 2 weeks in the eye of the hurricane of Beatlemania? What's it like to go from being a regular guy to the next day girls are trying to tear your clothes off as you get out of a limousine?
Right.
And then I wondered, all right, now you've just reached the pinnacle of entertainment fame in the music world. What do you do now? How do you live the rest of your life after having that incredible, intense fame moment for 2 weeks? So that's how I structured the book, really, into 3 parts. And each part, to me, contained thousands of surprises and shock, and, you know, because it's, to the world, he was really an unknown journeyman drummer, and then suddenly he's selected to help save the Beatles' first world tour. He does a great job. But though those 13 days of fame made headlines for him, the true mystery of Jimmy Nichol's story is riddled with blacklisting, betrayal, drugs, divorce, bankruptcy, and an eventual disappearance that led many to question whether he's dead or alive.
Right, and it's amazing because you've done extensive research, interviews about his life. And how long did you, when you decided that this was a project you were, embarking on? How long did the process take before, from when you started to finishing the book?
Well, I would say total 8 years,
wow.
Believe it or not. 6 years were spent doing the research and interviewing people. The 7th year was spent traveling in his footsteps to places like London, Holland, Mexico, and Sydney, Adelaide, and Melbourne, just to get a feel for, are there any fingerprints left in these places, etc. And that makes up the actual last chapter of the book, where I go in search of him and what I find out. And that was fascinating, as was the research. And then about a year to create a marketing plan and self-publish and
sure.
put the book out. And I'm happy to say it became an Amazon bestseller and won a Quilly Award. So I'm thrilled that people really find this an interesting history and mystery revolving around the Beatles.
It really is. I mean, it's such an interesting story, as you said. I mean, obviously, because not many people know about Jimmy Nicol. Can you tell us a little bit about what you found as far as a little bit of Jimmy's history leading up? How did he get the gig? Was it, how did he get pulled in? I mean, because I'd heard that the Beatles, it was basically an emergency situation. They were about to go on tour.
Right. Well, it was a dire emergency because this was the first ever world tour. Brian Epstein, in fact, I was able to go into these archives of Brian Epstein's records related to the world tour.
Wow.
Which were amazing. So everything back then, if you can believe it, was done by mail, or stale mail, as the kids say today.
Right.
So you had to send letters all over the world and say, we're planning to come here, send me the promoter's agreement, let's line up the insurance in that country. George may need to rent a guitar in that city. I need 2 hotel rooms for the Beatles with 2 beds in each room. I need a suite outside for them to entertain. I need another suite next door for Neil Aspinall and Mal Evans, their helpers.
Right.
All these little details made up really hundreds of pages of letters. And he did travel to Australia to make a deal with the promoter there. So he spent about a half a year putting all these contracts together, working out when can the Beatles release songs or singles in those countries so that there's new attention drawn to them when they come, sell more tickets. So it was like with military precision, they were ready to go the very next day.
Wow.
And suddenly, Ringo Starr collapses at a photo shoot at 12 noon the day before the world tour. So the toughest part first was that Epstein had to convince John, Paul, and George to even go on the tour without Ringo.
Right.
And George was dead set against it. He said, if we're not going out with the four of us, then we're not the Beatles, and I'm not going. So it took a lot of time and pressure and discussion to get George to agree even to allow this. And years later, he said at during the anthology, he said it was foolish, we shouldn't have done it. But back then, there were no out clauses in these contracts.
Right.
You couldn't get out for an illness like you can nowadays with concerts and tours. And basically, the Beatles and Epstein would have been ruined financially with a lot of lawsuits and litigation had they not gone through with the tour. And so this is not only that, as you recall, in those days, in the 60s, bands only were thought to have a short shelf life of fame,
Right.
and then they were done. No one knew the Beatles would be this great legacy musical band. So they thought, well, if we have this black mark on our record, this could be the end of our selling music, the end of touring, if we don't show up. So, having explained all that to them, George reluctantly went along, and then they just had, part of an afternoon to find someone and rehearse him and see if he could go. And Jimmy Nicol didn't even own a suitcase at this point, didn't have a passport, and they were leaving the next morning at 7 or 8 in the morning. So the interesting thing was Nicol was not the first drummer they looked to. They looked to a guy named Ray Duval, who had played on tours in Liverpool where the Beatles were on the same bill.
Right.
And he said no because he was busy with his own nightclub and didn't want to be away. Then after strike one, they called a drummer named Bobby Graham, who Epstein knew was like the top session drummer in London and who had worked with Joe Brown, a friend of the Beatles. And Graham was really concerned that if he went, that he wouldn't be the top session man anymore. And at the time, session men were making 3 times the average wage of someone in Britain.
Right.
So he turned it down because he didn't want the guy that sets up the sessions to penalize him for being missing for 2 weeks. So Graham suggested Jimmy Nicol, and I found actual BBC footage where Brian Epstein had actually been in a studio with Jimmy Nicol and observed him playing. So it's clear to me that Epstein was aware of Nicol as a potential drummer.
Right.
Nicol at the time was also the drummer in Georgie Fame and the Blue Flames. They were a very popular live band in London at the time, and Paul McCartney was friends with Georgie Fame. So actually, once that name came up, Paul called Georgie Fame and said, hey, can we borrow your drummer for a couple of weeks for a tour? Georgie Fame said, sure. And then Epstein had George Martin, the producer, call over to Jimmy Nicol's home and ask him if he would come down to Abbey Road for a little rehearsal.
Wow. Absolutely. I mean, incredible. It's like getting picked for, rock and roll lottery.
Yeah.
And getting this opportunity. I saw a bootleg, chronicling Jimmy Nicol's performances, and there is, I haven't heard the track, but there's a small track that makes reference to rehearsals. Did they have time to rehearse before they left to go on the road? I mean, did they do much rehearsing?
They didn't do much. What they did was they went down to Abbey Road, and apparently Georgie Fame's publicist heard about it from Georgie Fame, so he brought all these media people who were not really needed at that time
Right.
to come down to Abbey Road. So they had to pose for pictures and do some little things. And I think that track you're referring to that's on the bootleg is only about 20, 30 seconds long.
Right.
It's basically the Beatles standing around Jimmy, and he's just doing a little drum solo. But what actually happened on the inside that day, because I found someone who was inside Abbey Road for the tryout, which is, it's incredible to get eyewitness accounts.
Right, of course.
A lot of music books tend to be cut and paste out of People magazine, which was, secondhand gossip. So this guy explained that what they did was the Beatles said to Jimmy, we want to run through our set list for a concert, which tended to be about 28 minutes long. And they ran through the set list, and John Lennon's jaw just dropped to the floor and said, you know all of Ringo's parts? And Jimmy said, yep. And that's sort of the amazing thing about the stars aligning to keep the Beatles going.
Right.
The one guy they find, the third choice, knows all of Ringo's parts on these specific songs, which again is something that I found from years of digging into his studio work, that he had done work on Beatle cover songs. So really a fascinating thing. The only rehearsal they did then before getting on the airplane the next day was this one trip through the set list.
Wow. That's incredible, because I mean, I don't know if you've ever done a taste test, so to speak, for your ears, but I mean, he locks in with the group. I mean,
yeah.
and obviously does a great job replicating Ringo's style. If you were to listen, if I was to play, and I'm not going to do it on the program, but if I was to play a Jimmy Nicol track versus a Ringo track, can you tell the difference?
I think you can. I mean, because I spent so much time studying that so that I could explain it in the book.
Right.
The thing to keep in mind is Jimmy's a right-handed drummer and Ringo was a left-handed drummer.
Good point, right.
And so that makes a big difference. The other thing, too, is I think from watching Jimmy play some Beatles songs, I think he skipped a few of Ringo's drum fills here and there,
right,
just to try to keep it simple, because he did want to keep on track, because he's like the driver of the bus as the drummer, and he wants to keep everyone locked together, and there's already the difficulty of the loud screaming that made it hard for them in those days to hear each other and stay locked together. So he simplified some of the work that Ringo did on the records for that reason. He also had a slightly different style. He used to hit the drums much harder than Ringo, and that comes through, at least visually. It's hard with the quality of bootlegs and whatnot to really hear the difference, but he used to pop his seat up very high, and he used to use his full arms and shoulders to bang on the snare drums and the tom-toms and the cymbals, whereas Ringo had very strong wrists and just used his wrists to keep the drumming rhythm going.
Right.
So there's another difference, but everybody has their own style, and then righty versus lefty.
Sure. It seems with a lot of the press footage that is out with Jimmy and the rest of the group, it seemed like he kind of locked in with the group and got along with them, and there was a great camaraderie. In your research, did you find or unearth any kind of insights as far as like how he got along with the guys during this period of time?
Yes, there are quite a few anecdotes, insider anecdotes that I put in the book that talk about his relationship as it developed over the course of the tour, and I would say by and large it was all quite positive. There was one guy who I think was a drummer in another band who I think had wanted to be the substitute for Ringo. So some of his comments tend to be a little sour grapes.
Sure.
But, everyone else you talk to on that tour, whether they were a promoter or some of the Beatles' own comments themselves, I talked to Tony Bramwell, one of their assistants.
Right.
I talked to Derek Taylor before he passed
Wow.
away. It was all very cordial and fun, and the key was when I interviewed Tony Sheridan before he passed away.
Wow.
It's incredible. I think 10 people passed away from the time I interviewed them until the book came out, so I was very fortunate in able to, get the questions in.
Of course.
But Tony Sheridan explained to me that on their first plane trip from London over to Hong Kong, he was on the plane. The Beatles didn't know it. They were up in first class with Jimmy, and he sent just a hello up with the flight attendant, and the Beatles said, "Oh my gosh, bring him up." So they spent 10, 12 hours together, and the interesting thing, and this was the thing that really, in my mind, bonded Jimmy to the Beatles, was the fact that Tony Sheridan explained to the Beatles, Jimmy played with me in London before I ever played with you guys in Hamburg.
Wow.
So they had a real respect for Jimmy, and he was a very cordial guy, and I feel that they bonded well, both socially and, like you were saying, locking in as the tour went on and as Jimmy got more experience. It's really evident in the Adelaide show where they played 4 shows in 2 days. Jimmy was completely locked in, and I show some amazing pictures of that where, like, the Beatles are smiling and maybe John's looking over his shoulder at Jimmy, and
right.
Those kind of looks that you see between band members. It was really cool.
It's kind of jokingly, it's like everywhere Jimmy went, he knew everybody's drum parts. It seemed to make obviously he had a background doing session work and playing with other guys, and like you said,
right.
being a journeyman drummer. There's, I guess, a little bit of speculation, because obviously this was a short-term opportunity for him. How do you, I guess, within your research, was he approached in this is a short period of time and you're not going to have a chance to be in the group?
Right.
Was that laid out for him, I guess, contractually?
Yes, it was laid out for him by Brian Epstein right after he passed that Abbey Road audition. They went into an office and that was what was discussed. And so he understood that. However, having said that, from looking at later, he did a later interview that had never been released before in Holland in 1984, and the Holland convention organizers were kind enough to let me use that in my book. So it was the first time that information's ever been made public. And he indicated in that book, in that interview, that he felt that perhaps he had a chance to replace Ringo permanently because he was getting on so well socially and in the band. I think it was a naive thought on his part,
right?
But when you read the interview in my book, you can see he's very serious about it, and he says some cryptic things like, I know some things that, that I'll reveal someday about this, but that Brian Epstein put a kibosh on that possibility.
Wow. It's incredible. Going back a few years, so after, the Ringo joins them in Australia and Jimmy is kind of sent off, there's a great photograph of him waiting for his airplane to go back to, I guess, London.
Yeah.
And it kind of says a lot because it's very, it's just him by himself. He kind of, I guess he went back to work and tried to do things, but he did slip into obscurity. When and how did he, can you explain, I guess, his journey into, going into obscurity?
Well, in his mind, he wasn't, going to fade into obscurity. In fact, in his mind, he wanted to redouble his efforts and actually compete against the Beatles, which may sound funny nowadays, but back in those days, pop bands were popping up and different people hit the top of the charts all the time. And he felt that he could ride all of the media attention from this and start his own band, which in his case he was actually restarting his own band, which was called Jimmy Nickel and the Shub Dubs. They had worked in the studio and put out a single, so now when he got back, Pi Records wanted to put out another single and have him tour, and they set him up. They put him on Top of the Pops, the same show as the Rolling Stones were on, and he got to, Dave Clark of the Dave Clark Five got ill, and their band couldn't then perform at this long stretch of 2 weeks at some concert venue, so Jimmy Nickel's band was slotted in as top of the slot. They got a lot of attention that way. They sold a lot of tickets, made a lot of money. But it was his goal to try to beat the Beatles at their own game. Now, the tough thing is, if you think about it, a drummer who doesn't sing and is way in the back is going to have a hard time being a top act.
Right.
Now, think about instead today, Dave Grohl was in the back of Nirvana and many people knew Kurt Cobain's name when Nirvana came out, but
Right.
they didn't know the name of the drummer. Now today, Dave Grohl's one of the most beloved rock stars in the world, but you notice he's writing his own music, he plays guitar, he sings lead, and he's up front and center.
Right, he made the jump, yeah.
So that's the way to do it, not sit in the back and have some nameless guy sing some tunes.
Right.
So Jimmy didn't know that, and he made some mistakes along the way. That band disbanded around the end of '64 because they were all session players, and they could make a lot more doing sessions than they could touring. Then Jimmy started a new band in the start of 1965, and again it got a lot of attention and such, but in the end it fizzled out. And by 1 year after being a Beatle, he was bankrupt, he had no work,
Wow.
his wife had divorced him, and he was living back with his mom. So imagine how far he fell in 1 year. But he then, and in fact, it's interesting, I note in here that Paul McCartney secretly read about this and tried to help him out. He had Peter and Gordon hire Jimmy for some tour dates and a little bit of recording, and I interviewed both of them.
Wow.
And, the Beatles, I think, were always rooting for Jimmy afterwards, but, it's not like they could do much about his career.
Sure.
But within a year, he's down in the dumps, and he had gotten some sort of offer to play drums for like a play in London, and he was mulling that over when he got a mysterious call from another country, and they said, hey, we play rock and roll, and we're touring the world, and Jimmy loved to travel. Would you like to join our band? You'll be a full member, like all of us. You'll get paid the same we do. You'll get royalties from any records, etc. So he walked out the door, never said goodbye to his family, friends, musicians, got on an airplane, and he vanished. And this became a pattern, and that's why I thought of the title, The Beatle Who Vanished.
Right. That's absolutely. I mean, it's intriguing, and it's such like a mystery.
It is, yeah. I mean, each time he would vanish from say this first group, he would walk out the door again and not tell them where he was going. And so that's why it took 6 years of research, because I had to uncover a lot of rocks before I could find out where he went next, and then delve into that whole part of his life and career.
It's kind of, I mean, it's so intriguing because you don't really understand, or you can't possibly understand the what must go through a young person's head when they are, inside the eye of the hurricane, as they called it, going to this great, and what that does to you on an emotional level, and it must have been a very jarring, land back down to earth afterwards.
I think you have absolutely nailed it. I think that was the most difficult time. Was how do I top myself, and how do I keep doing that? And a lot of people have either written or said online and such, oh, he never did another thing after the Beatles. Well, that's extremely inaccurate.
Right.
And the fact is, from my research, he became a producer. He worked in A&R, developing acts for RCA.
Wow.
He recorded a number of albums with these bands that he played with and his own music. He did live shows. He was on television all over Mexico. He was a teacher. He taught music. He had his own radio show, like yourself. So he really had a remarkable career. It's just that once you're out of the international media's eye, people just assume you're sitting in a rocking chair somewhere.
Right. I had heard that when the Beatles in the '90s were putting together the anthology, that some of the documentary filmmakers tried to reach out to him, and they were told that he had passed away. Is there any truth to that?
That's absolutely true. That's something that I uncovered in the course of researching the book, and
Incredible.
that was never known before that. Jimmy actually, the interesting thing is Jimmy's son Howie was a film audio editor and was working by coincidence on the anthology. And Paul McCartney asked Howie, once he discovered that Howie was Jimmy's son, if Jimmy would like to come on and be in the film. And Howie went home and asked Jimmy if he'd like to do that, and Jimmy said, "Tell him I'm dead. I don't want to have anything to do with it."
Wow.
I explain more of why he does that and what's behind it. I don't want to give away the whole book.
Sure.
There's a lot of intrigue going on in him faking his own death.
I mean, obviously, just to even the I guess whatever it takes to tell people, no, you're dead.
And imagine, too, the pressure you're putting on your son, who's now coming up and trying to make it in the entertainment world, and he has to lie to a Beatle.
Right.
That's really tough on a son.
That's incredible. And I don't want to, give away the book, a lot of the details in it, but did you come across in your work relatives of Jimmy's? Did you how close did you get, without giving it away,
Sure.
did you get to finding Jimmy?
Well, his first wife had passed away. Otherwise, I would have talked to her.
Sure.
Many of his best friends, who were, of course, musicians, I talked to almost all of them who were alive, and most of them at the time were alive, and unfortunately, not all of them are anymore.
Right.
But, you're talking to people in their 70s,
Sure.
so, not everybody lives forever, and musicians tend to have a shorter lifespan.
Right.
I also spoke with his second wife, Julia, who lives today in Mexico City, and she told me quite a bit about his mysterious life there. Recently, after the book came out, I was contacted by a guy named Ronnie Nichol, who lives in Edinburgh, Scotland, and Ronnie is the first cousin of Jimmy Nichol.
Wow.
And I think they're the same exact age, but maybe 1 month apart. Their dads were brothers,
Right.
in Scotland. And so he gave me some new additional material and information about what it was like seeing Jimmy when they were kids and growing up, and Jimmy then touring Scotland. Because Jimmy toured Scotland on one tour package that crisscrossed Scotland at the same time the Beatles were touring Scotland,
Wow.
which is kind of interesting.
That's I was going to ask you, knowing that Jimmy, wanted to not be in the spotlight, and kind of obviously with the death, faking the death thing, and not wanting to do interviews. Did you ever during your research feel like maybe I'm barking up the wrong tree? Maybe if I actually get to Jimmy Nichol, he's not going to want me to. He's not going to want to see me because this is exactly what he's avoiding. Did you ever feel any kind of, both sides of that, like intrigue, but also maybe I'm doing the wrong thing?
Well, a lot of those things about how Jimmy felt and such were not known until I had really spent many years already researching his life,
right,
and discovering that he blamed Brian Epstein for the failure of his first band or two in London, and thought he had been blacklisted, and he gave his reasons and such. But so that may have played into his bitterness later in the years. But I guess I thought if he knew that someone was actually showing him, filling out his whole life and career, and showing how talented he was before, during, and after the Beatles, I thought he would appreciate that. I mean, I easily could have written a whole book just about the Beatle tour.
Right.
And that would have been that. But that would be the same as just filling out that little footnote that always bothered me.
Right, right.
We'd know what he did with the Beatles more than a sentence, but we wouldn't know where did he come from, what was his backstory, and what did he do to deal with the fame afterwards, which is why I think the book is more interesting to readers. Some people have said to me they love the book not because they're big Beatle fans, but because they're mystery fans.
Right.
And they enjoy the last part of the book with where he vanished to. So I didn't feel too bad. I actually describe going to visit him at the end of my book, but I want to leave that for readers to find out on their own. It's pretty interesting.
Do you think that there will ever be a time where Jimmy Nicol might go public again?
I can pretty much say that he's never going to go public.
Incredible. I mean, incredible. I mean, it's funny because he's never cashed in on the Beatle name. He's never put out any books or anything like that, and it seems like being such a huge part of history, that there is this desire for fans and people, even the remaining Beatles would probably want to know what Jimmy's up to. You definitely think he wouldn't go public.
Well, I highly recommend that the remaining Beatles read my book.
I'm looking forward to it. It is. I'm going to be spending the next couple of weeks unwinding with this book. We've got a few minutes left. I wanted to get in just to talk a little bit about your other work, if we could. I know.
Before we move on, though, can I let people know where they could find the book?
Of course, please.
If interested. Well, first of all, if you want a free excerpt of the book to get a taste of what it's like, you can go to thebeatlewhovanished.com, and also if you order from the website, then I send out an autographed copy. But also, if you're just in a big hurry, it's a great Christmas gift. You can go to Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com.
That's great, and I'm you've done a few books. And obviously, you mentioned earlier that you'd done some consultant and other research work for George Harrison. I got to ask you, on your website, you mentioned that you had done a little bit of work for Maria Elena from Buddy Holly's widow. Can you tell us a little bit? I'm a big Buddy Holly fan. I'd love to know what kind of what kind of work you were.
Well, I believe that was probably in the 90s, I think, and she was looking for lost demos, lost recordings of Buddy Holly's that had not been released officially, and maybe it was because she wanted to do some sort of box set project or something with a record label.
Right.
And I was able to dig up a lot of rare Buddy Holly material for her. And so that was a great honor to be called by her. She was a very nice woman, and of course, everybody's a Buddy Holly fan.
Sure.
So that was a big honor for me.
And of course, you did a book on the group Nirvana about the Nevermind recordings. And what was, jumping from the Beatles to Nirvana, or vice versa, how did your interest in the group Nirvana start, and how did you get involved in that book?
I've been longtime friends with producer Butch Vig, who's also a drummer, by the way.
Of course, right.
And Butch Vig produced that album, and it's interesting because when that album came out, it did so many things. It toppled all the big hair bands. They disappeared immediately.
Right.
It toppled Michael Jackson. It toppled U2. It toppled country music, which was in the top of the charts. And it really started a whole new era for rock and roll, maybe a third generation of rock and roll that was, much louder, more raw. They called it grunge or alternative music. It turned it, then you suddenly had alternative radio stations and things. So I was fascinated by that, and it seemed to me that this particular album captured the era for that generation, and that in the same way that Sgt. Pepper maybe reflected the 60s generation.
Right.
So I was fascinated by that parallel. So I started asking Butch Vig about it because he had produced it, and found, for example, that Kurt Cobain was a huge Beatles fan. And so I saw some interesting connections there. So I, with his cooperation, I started to research and write a book about just the making of that album, because I had read a book as a kid about one single baseball game. It was like 300-page book. Every little thing that went on in the baseball game that you never see.
Right.
Unspoken signals or an injury you're not aware of or whatever. And I wanted to translate that type of book to music, and I picked Nevermind Nirvana as the album to do it, so that if you ever wanted to know how the songs were written, what was going on in the minds of the performers, how did they interact with the producer, who mixed the album, who mastered the album, what went wrong, what went right, and then finally sort of almost a sociological chapter on why was this album so important to the generation who grew up in the 90s.
Right.
So that was kind of the interest in it, and it was a fascinating project, and through Butch I was able to get great cooperation from the band members and from their record label and managers, and get some rare documents and pictures taken and things like that.
That's
another fun book.
It is.
Rock and Roll Detective is not limited to just one band or one decade.
You know, I want to ask, and this is a somewhat controversial topic, but being the rock and roll detective, have you heard about, and also because you have the Nirvana book, have you heard about that the recent film talking about the conspiracy around the Kurt Cobain murders slash suicide? What's your opinion about the that whole investigation with Tom Grant and the documentary?
Well, I've read into a lot of, the other thing is I'm a lawyer as well. So in the law, just as in doing good research, you try to look at what are the facts,
right.
What is the evidence, and then on the other side, well, what are these things that are just theories, or it must have been this because someone used his credit card after he died,
right.
and all these things. And when you start to look into these conspiracy theories, you tend to see a lot of flaws, because facts of something that really happened tend to fit together nicely, and conspiracy theories, when you really dig down deep and get to the facts behind them, tend to not fit together well. Just like if you catch someone lying and you keep asking them more and more questions, you see how their story sort of unravels.
Right.
So, just based on my taking a look at that, I don't believe there was a conspiracy to kill Kurt Cobain. I believe that, he was in a lot of pain and decided to end his own life.
Sure. And that's the, it's one of the topics of the day, because, obviously when you have such a brilliant talent, pass away so early in life,
I know.
It becomes such
one thing related to that I might mention is, I appear on the Reels TV channel, and I actually did an episode on Kurt Cobain. The show is called Celebrity Legacies, and they do replay these shows quite frequently. I did a John Lennon, a Kurt Cobain, and an Elvis Presley.
Wow.
For Celebrity Legacies. So if people watch Reels TV, they'll find me chatting away about Kurt Cobain. And then there's also a show they have called Celebrity Damage Control, and I did a show on Keith Richards for the damage.
I love it. I mean, you've done a lot of great stuff so far, and I mean, obviously this new book on Jimmy Nicol, the Beatle who vanished, is really fascinating. Do you have anything under the hood, so to speak, in the kitchen you're working on that you can share with us, that for the future, I guess for 2016 that you got? Right.
Well, I am doing some work to help out on a Butch Vig's company is putting out a new documentary that will be about the Smart Studio story, which is the studio where he first produced Nirvana and Smashing Pumpkins, and then did a lot of studio work for Beck and U2 and other bands. On my own, I am working on a new book, which I don't think I want to tell you what it's about, because some people write faster than others.
Sure.
And I'll just say that it'll be more rock and roll history and a little bit of rock and roll mystery. I don't know whether it'll come out next year or the year after, but I think it'll be a fun book that will appeal to people who are interested in some of the things that have happened in rock and roll history and involve several different bands.
I love it. I look forward to it. Well, Jim, I got to thank you so much for being on the program and so much for sharing, these details, obviously, about Jimmy Nicol and, of course, all the work that you've done. Your book, The Beatle Who Vanished, is available on your website, the rockandrolldetective.com, and, of course, Amazon. I want to thank you so much for being on the program, and we'd love to have you come back, when you're getting closer to releasing your next book. We'd love to, have you on, and we'll talk all about it. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, thanks, Eddie. It was a real honor being on your show. I really appreciate it, and I sure enjoyed our chat.
Well, thank you so much, and hopefully, have a great holiday season. We'll talk to you hopefully soon.
Sounds good. You too. Thank you.
You got it. Thank you very much, Jim. Take care. There it is.